Unfortunately, this lecture had to be rescheduled to now. It was scheduled for yesterday at 4:30, and because of the faculty meeting, it had to be rescheduled until now. And so, unfortunately, we don't have as many people coming as we had originally anticipated. A lot of people from media studies couldn't come at this time. But anyway, we're very happy to have Toby Miller with us. This is the third and final event in the Language, Mind, Culture lecture series. As I mentioned last time, next year's series is really shaping up to be a great series. We already have Martha Nussbaum for next April and Hayden White hopefully next winter. So it's already shaping up to be a great series. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Toby Miller, who's widely recognized as one of the most important figures in the field of cultural studies and media studies. A native of Great Britain, Toby Miller has held appointments at the University of New South Wales, Murdoch University, and NYU, where for many years he was professor of cultural studies and cultural policy in the Department of Cinema Studies. He recently accepted a position at the University of California, Riverside, where he holds appointments in 3 departments: English, Sociology, and Women's Studies, and is also the director of the program in Film and Visual Culture, which he is currently transforming into a department. Toby Miller has published on a wide variety of topics. He is the author and editor of over 20 books, and his current research covers the success of Hollywood overseas, the links between culture and citizenship, and anti-Americanism. He has published extensively in the areas of media, sports, labor, gender, race, citizenship, politics, and cultural policy. His most recent books include Cultural Citizenship, Cosmopolitanism, Consumerism, and Television in a Neoliberal Age. That's 2007. Spy Screen, Espionage on Film and TV from the 1930s to the 1960s, Oxford, 2003. Television, Critical Concepts in Cultural and Media Studies. Sports Sex, Film and Theory and Anthology. Toby Miller is also the editor of the journal Television and New Media and the series Sport and Culture for the University of Minnesota Press. He's currently working on 4 projects, and I'll just list them now. Made Over Culture, Television, The Basics, Global Media Studies, and, you'll like this one, Step Away from the Croissant. Toby Miller has been interviewed on PBS NewsHour, the History Channel, CNN, CNBC, BBC, ESPN Sports Center, but not yet on Fox News. Please welcome Toby Miller.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks also to Chris, the both of yous, as people used to say in New York, for organizing this, and, of course, to Middlebury for having me here. I left New York for LA in 2004 for 2 reasons. 2 reasons that I'll talk about here. One set of reasons was hedonistic, and the other was professional. The professional part that's of interest, I guess, was that I wanted to get closer to the belly of the beast. That was one of my major preoccupations, to understand by being there, to the extent you can say that LA is Hollywood, exactly what it was and how it operated. And so I rented a house in the street where Julia Roberts lives. So I live in Venice Beach, in Julia Street. And her people have been in touch with my people. And we both know the others there. No one's prepared to make the first move to sit down and have a cup of tea or anything like that, as we would both like to do. We're leaving it at the moment up to our proxies to negotiate the possibility of a scone or 2, or perhaps a squash game. Who knows? So it's been a subtle professional self-inculcation, as it were, into Hollywood. Now, of course, at some level, I don't need to live in LA to know about Hollywood. All of us in this room, most people around the world, know a lot about Hollywood. We have to, given its presence on cinema, computer, telephone, and television screens. Each year, 1/6 of the world's population watches at least some part of the Academy Awards on TV. More movie tickets are sold each year than there are people on the planet. And of course, when it comes to revenue, Hollywood movie ticket sales in the United States are nothing compared to the expenditure on electronic games, although by a much smaller number of people, because the unit costs are very different. And many of the companies that make computer games, whether they be objects that you buy or online games that you subscribe to, are either owned in Hollywood, managed in Hollywood, or draw a lot of their creative inspiration from people in and around Southern California, though of course other parts of the United States and other countries as well. The very word Hollywood, in some sense, presents to us an invitation to replication, to domination, all kinds of forms of pleasure, all kinds of forms of fear and anxiety as well. The bugbears of cultural imperialism, cultural domination, industrialization of cultural production, industrialization of aesthetics, ideas of an appeal supposedly to the lowest common denominator. You know all the debating points that we hear on this point. And in fact, not only is it important in terms of those debating points, it's of increasing importance to the United States economy. It's now claimed that entertainment products, many of them articulated through Hollywood, are actually responsible for a greater slice of US export sales than any other industry. It's overtaken aerospace, which for many years was the leading one. So today what I want to do is, first of all, just briefly run through some of the size of the industry, not at great length, but just so we have some figures to play with. Secondly, I want to try to explain, to the best of my ability, but drawing on your knowledges as well, why it is that Hollywood is so powerful, so dominant in different parts of the world. And I want specifically to spend a little bit of time talking about animation, because that's such an interesting domain, I think, and one that's been internationalized as a production site for Hollywood for a long time. And then I want to finish off with some things about the future, okay? So, US companies own between 40 and 90% of the movies that are screened around the world, depending, of course, on the place where you are. Between 1977 and 1996, the US copyright industries, which is the term the federal government likes to use, they don't like to say cultural industries or creative industries, as some countries do and as some critical scholars do. They try to get rid of the idea of culture, and they try to make sure that they have total governmentalization and total commodification simultaneously. The US copyright industries grew 3 times as quickly as the overall economy. The most popular 39 films around the world 10 years ago came from the United States. By popular, I mean receipts taken in, bottoms on seats. And at the same time, the condition of other major filmmaking countries was declining, and in many cases continues to decline. Let me give you some ideas. In 1998, the percentage of the box office taken by locally made films was the following. In Germany, 10%. In Britain, 12%. In France, 26%, in Spain, 12%, in Canada, 2%, in Australia, 4%, in Brazil, 5%. These are very dramatic decreases since the Second World War, in some cases dramatic decreases since the 1980s only. And of course, they represent a big change in Europe from what had been the case in the earlier part of the decade, when there'd been a rebounding in the major filmmaking countries and a restoration of the film-going audience from Hollywood. The story is equally dramatic in Eastern and Central Europe. For example, in 1990, perhaps the last full year that the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union, it released 215 films. That's 1990 in the USSR. 5 years later, the number was just 82. And double that number of films was imported from the United States in that year in the Soviet Union. The European film industry is now about 1/10 of the size it was at the end of the Second World War, when, of course, it had been decimated by what took place. So I think that shows you the significance of this. And if we look at the numbers from last year, in terms of total film receipts in 2006 for Hollywood, we're looking at a value of almost $26 billion. Almost $26 billion. For the purposes of accounting, domestic in the film industry includes Canada, by the way, as a place that's north of Toronto. You will appreciate such things. So domestic figures are Canada and the United States. They're North America minus Mexico, if you like. Domestic figures of that 25.8 billion that was the worldwide total, domestic figures are about 11 billion. So it's very clear that the outside world is now actually the major market for both amortizing the investments and getting profit on top of that. International box office went up last year by over 14% on 2005. So it's very dramatic, even as we're told that US influence may be diminishing in certain ways. The so-called soft power, slightly unfortunate phallic metaphor that Joe Nye, the political science professor and former Assistant Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, used, the so-called soft power of the United States, in that sense, could be said to be increasing. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I wondered if, at this point, I could draw on some of your expertise, if I could ask folks here if any of you have experiences or ideas or fantasies or knowledge of any kind that would explain this. Why do people outside this country go to Hollywood films, whether they go to them on television or in cinemas or on their computer screens? What is it? Has anybody got any ideas? There are no wrong answers, although, of course, my answers will be better than yours because I'm out the front.
I would think that it has something to do with children, that they're being vulnerable to American culture and drawing their parents, perhaps, to movies or making them watch certain shows.
Uh-huh.
Age
is certainly an important predictor, particularly in this country. The core of attendance at movie theatres, anyway, is between the ages of 14 and 29. That's really the vast majority of people who are going. And then, of course, there is an influence on that's really changed since the Second World War in all the First World and is increasingly changing in many other parts of the globe as well, which is that children are becoming determinants of parental expenditure in a whole array of popular culture arenas. If you go back to, say, the pre-war period, toys, for example, were not marketed to children in most parts of the world, including the United States. Direct marketing to children really takes off in the post-war period, and especially in the 1960s. That's why many of you have such lovely clothes on, those of you who are of my vintage, because we were marketed to so carefully when young. But that really didn't happen anywhere in the world very directly until that point, and it's become a stronger and stronger trend, and the tendency is particularly strong with the association of popular culture commodities with the United States. So I think that's a good answer, yeah. Anybody else?
Big action films that come out of Hollywood.
Right.
And special effects.
Big action films and special effects, very important. One of the nice things, if you're in a non-English speaking milieu, is that you don't have a lot of dialogue to deal with, so there's not a lot of translation to be done. The narratives are broad brush, they're spectacular. As you say, the effects are very important. There are very few film industries that can afford the amount of money that goes up on the screen, including the amount of money that's blown up on the screen, one might say, that can compare with Hollywood. Yeah, anything else? Yeah, there and then there.
It's also marketing. Few
Yes.
European film companies have the kind of marketing, and they pool resources in a Euro movie, which has not been terribly successful as a genre.
Right.
So marketing is a major part of any Hollywood film.
Absolutely true. The average budget for marketing a Hollywood film is probably 15 times the total budget from pre-production, through post-production, marketing, the whole kit and caboodle of, say, a French film or an Italian film or an Indian film. That's absolutely crucial. Yes. Yeah.
I was going to make a similar comment, just that I would guess the American film industry is the richest in the world, and thereby it will support celebrities and marketing campaigns, and thereby just make grander, more elaborate films that have wide popular appeal.
I think that's got a lot to do with it. Any more for any more? Yeah.
I was going to say, in the French context, it seems to me that more American films are willing to entertain, whereas many French films, when they make films that entertain, they get big public. But the structure of the industry and the funding is such that many films are made for a tight circle, and so you rather impress critics and colleagues and entertainment. It's quite a divide, I think, in France.
Yeah. I think that's right, although, of course, there are lots of films in the United States that are made that way, but they're not the ones we're really talking about when we talk about Hollywood. So, yes, the Economist magazine, I have an inner truck driver, an inner Wittgenstein, and an inner neoliberal, and my inner neoliberal is The Economist, and The Economist has this thing about the French make films that send people to sleep, the Asians make films that make people excited, and Hollywood makes films that make people excited and then end up sleeping well. Yeah, I think you had a suggestion too.
I like that. From my experience in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, I would have said something like lifestyle envy. We're the richest, most glamorous, best people on earth, and everybody else wants to be like us and see how we live, how we dress,
Mhm.
And when the Soviet Union fell apart, after so many years of prohibition, everybody suddenly went wild and
Mhm.
to see American films.
Right, and you see those extraordinary lineups of people to get into McDonald's in Moscow and in Beijing, right, when they were first opening. And I guess during the Soviet Union also, the sale of jeans, denim jeans that were from the United States would supposedly on the black market go for exorbitant prices, right? So, for example, yeah. So, interesting point. Anybody else? Okay, well, those are all great explanations, and I kind of agree with them to a certain extent. I think they're all correct, but I think there are other factors as well. And normally, you're actually slightly different from most audiences I ask about this, because most audiences simply tell me, and there's a little bit of this in some of our comments, we make films that people like, and they're better than anybody else's, and the reason they're better than anybody else's is twofold, I'm told. One is we're a melting pot, multiculturally, because of all the different background experiences of the population going right back to the 18th century, and as a consequence, the film-going practices that were pioneered here were practices that would make sense to people for whom English was a second or a third language or even a non-existent language, right? So the stories had to be bold, stark narratives, and they had to be things that people from right across 30, 40, 50 language groups and class barriers could comprehend. And that pressure to find an economical storytelling mode and one that used spectacle was really what made Hollywood. So that's the first reason I'm given. And then the second reason tends to be that because Hollywood is laissez-faire, because it's the acme of capitalism without the participation of the state, it has an inexorable, inevitable, powerful link to desire. In other words, if you think in neoclassical economics terms, supply and demand are really meant to function in the case of Hollywood because of the passion. If people don't like the movies, they don't go, and then those movie makers don't get to make other films. That's meant to be how it works. Whereas it is claimed in the case of the French, whom we were talking about, because of the ticket levy that becomes part of the basis for funding the domestic industry, that there is not this supply and demand nexus that laissez-faire capitalism generates. So those tend to be the two arguments that are made. And we get those from, if you like, people on the street, from a lot of fairly conservative critics, from neoclassical/neoliberal economists, and so on. That there was a particular narrative form, a particular visual style that derived from having this very diverse population, and that, as a consequence of having the state disinvolved, if you like, the industry became a massively efficient one and very capable of responding directly and immediately to audience desires. So it's a kind of Panglossian world where Hollywood is the golden mean for images that can mean everything to everybody. It's a mixture of Pollyanna and Pangloss in some sense. But what fascinates me about this is that I think there are a couple of events very related to the state, to government, that are extremely important here. Up until the end of World War I, Hollywood was a net importer of both film stock, the technology for making films, celluloid and so on, and the technology for filming it, and the technology for editing it, and the technology for exhibiting it, mostly from France, and a net importer of movies themselves. But I mentioned World War I. What happened to the major film industries in World War I? They were destroyed. They were absolutely decimated. And it was after that Hollywood managed, through a series of, guess what, piracy activities, to borrow filmmaking technology and become the champion of filmmaking technology and a net exporter of cameras, editors, projectors, celluloid, having been a net importer, as well as a net exporter of film texts themselves. So there's the opportunity given by what happened essentially to the German and the French film industries in the First World War. And by industries, I don't just mean filmmaking, but literally the manufacture of the technology as well. At the same time, the US film industry, which had been located, a lot of it on the Lower East Side of New York City, moved west. Why did it move west? It moved west for two reasons. One, somebody calculated the number of days of sunshine you got each year in Southern California versus the Lower East Side. And two, somebody calculated the number of people and the strength of unions, trade unions on the Lower East Side compared to Southern California, shall we say, and found that Southern California essentially had no unions, and the Lower East Side was filled with the Jewish socialists who were the enemies of the Jewish non-socialists who were running the film industry. Right? And they skedaddled over to avoid the clouds, find the sun, avoid the unions, find the workers. So they had all these incentives. They go over there, and then this is right at the time that the bottom is falling out of what were the other major filmmaking industries. So that's a really key moment when they managed to reduce production costs through avoiding unions and also have more export opportunities. When the Second World War comes around, same story. This time it's not just the German and the French film industries which had recovered, it's the Italian film industry and the Japanese film industry that are decimated by the war. And as part of the Marshall Plan, which was the plan produced by the former Secretary of State and US General George Marshall, that was going to regenerate industry in Western Europe and protect it from the dual privations, terrors and pleasures of fascism and state socialism, part of the condition for the Marshall Plan, massive loans and investments made by the United States in the defeated powers, was that many Hollywood films that had been kept out of those countries, not only during the Second World War but before it, the Japanese, the Italians, the Germans, had essentially closed things down under fascism and not permitted the importation of Hollywood films. All the backlog had to be accepted straight away. So suddenly you had things like the release of 2,000 Hollywood films in the space of a couple of years in these countries in the late 40s, right after the war, when their own filmmaking industries essentially barely existed. So that, along with the fact that, of course, many of these countries were liberated by the United States, along with the Soviet Union, along with even pathetic old Britain, and a few other players, meant that there was a pro-Yankee position, just as you described with reference to the Soviet Union, for good reason. This was a moment of liberation for, as we know, tens of millions of people, but there was also this component that was at the harsh Machiavellian level of the political economy, a new opportunity that was carved out as a consequence, yet again, of the decimation of the industry, and then as a quid pro quo for all the funding support that was provided through the Marshall Plan of entry for US cinema. And what we begin to see in between the two world wars, but especially after the Second World War, is the emergence of what I call this new international division of cultural labour, which is a term that we used in our books. I wrote them with 3 or 4 other people, called Global Hollywood and Global Hollywood 2. If anybody is interested in the film rights to Global Hollywood 2, then see me afterwards. It's a rip-roaring tale. So, as you probably know, if you look back at the people who are actually making Hollywood films in what's called the classical period of Hollywood filmmaking in the 30s and 40s, a lot of them are not from the United States. There are people from India, people from Japan, lots of people from Eastern and Central Europe, lots of people from Britain. When Alfred Hitchcock moved from Britain to Hollywood, I guess probably during the Second World War, around that time, he was asked by some snobby, nasty British people what it was like being with all those awful Americans. And he said, I don't know. I don't meet any of them in Hollywood. There aren't any there. Which you could say plays into the argument that I was dismissing, namely that because of this multicultural coming together, there was a lingua franca found of storytelling. But it certainly shows that Hollywood was very open to difference. That's certainly true, and that's always been true. Difference, of course, that gets smushed together through a certain industrial apparatus and money-making machine, but nevertheless, very open to getting people, especially for cheap, from anywhere in the world who were good at what they did. And that continues. But then if you look back, for instance, over the years, you find that there is a whitening and an anglicizing, not only of names, but of styles as well. And if we think about the recent Academy Awards this year that were heralded as truly international opportunities and so on, international really means British and Australian white men and a few white women being allowed to act in Hollywood films and taking home goblets for them. It still means maybe if you're Mexican or Spanish you can get something along the line, but it's more likely to be makeup than anything else. So whilst there is this invitation to difference and this extraordinary outreach to involve people of competence in the Hollywood system from anywhere around the world, it also tends to involve a certain flattening out, a blanching, and so on. And what we go on to argue in the book, which I won't go into in great detail here because of time and so on, is that there is a division of labour that operates such that, as John Ford put it, the great film director in the 60s in an interview with the BBC, Hollywood isn't a place we don't really know where it is. It could be anywhere. Or as Wim Wenders, the great German film director, put it, the Americans have colonized our unconscious. But then the point is, who are the Americans at the end of all of that when they're making films so much for the foreign audience? And they're not necessarily addressing questions of US national culture and its politics and its problems when they think about a special effects movie or a shoot 'em up, because there is such a focus nowadays on that vital overseas audience that I mentioned. So let me just illustrate this with some specific examples. I'm going to talk now, as I said earlier, a little bit about the animation sector. But let me just halt for a second before I go on to animation and ask if there are any questions or thoughts folks have had. Yeah?
On the issue of the Marshall Plan, and
Yeah.
did that also apply to books, to music, to other things that have been kept out, or were films a special category?
Films were a special category. I don't know to what extent it may have been used in certain other sectors, but they were a special category because right back in the 20s and 30s, during the period when films were not protected speech, under the Supreme Court, films did not count as protected speech as per the First Amendment between 1915 and 1952. They were not seen as speech, they were not seen as art, they were seen purely as industry, nothing else under the law. And it was during that period that the Department of Commerce and the Department of State got very intimately intertwined with the film industry because Will Hayes, who had been the Postmaster General under Herbert Hoover, I think, and became the sort of czar, in a sense, of the Hollywood film industry. In order to avoid regulation, they went into a form of self-regulation because they were worried, since they were not protected under the First Amendment, that there would be a lot of government censorship of the films they made and they would lose their audience. They engaged in a form of self-censorship through the Motion Picture Association of America. Hayes was the boss of that. He'd been in the administration. He quickly made the point. He had a famous saying that he used again and again in meetings with people he'd been in cabinets with in the government: trade follows the film. This was the mantra, trade follows the film. And they had all sorts of stories about it. And they had lots of film producers who were very interested in this. Walter Wanger, for example, was intimately involved in this. And the idea was that, therefore, because film would be a model for other industries, but would also show the American lifestyle on screen and make that emulable and desirable, would be a market for different American goods. That worked very, very effectively with state and with commerce. And so they acted as plenipotentiaries for the film industry throughout the interwar period. And during the war itself, of course, Hollywood became, in a sense, another arm of the state. If you think about all those wartime dramas, many of them were made in very intimate connection with the federal government, particularly the defense forces, the military, and so forth. And that's often listed in the films. And that connection has gone on ever since. There are many, almost every film that has anything to do with the US military has the script okayed by the Pentagon, and in many cases rewritten, in the same way that it's normally the case that any medical drama is sent to the American Medical Association for vetting before it's put into production, because they can't afford to have the AMA attack them. So there's been an intimate relationship now over 7 decades, actually, that means that there's this ongoing connection that can be drawn on at almost any moment. So, I mean, I'll go on about this towards the end, but right after September the 11th, one of the first things the federal government did was set up a series of regular luncheons with the Hollywood Washington Committee, it's called, where Jack Valenti, who'd been Lyndon Johnson's personal assistant when LBJ was president and left that to become for 40 years the boss of the Motion Picture Association of America, set up regular meetings with senators, with congresspeople, and so on, to talk about, for example, how the special effects ideas and the action-adventure fantasies of Hollywood could be used in advance of future terrorist attacks. How one might, for example, deploy ideas that were not yet in film form but could be, to provide the Defense Department with ideas about how to protect the nation. So, there are very intimate connections. University of Southern California, the private university of spoilt children, as it's sometimes called, in LA, but actually a very great school, not only has football and basketball, but also has bombs. They have a facility in Marina del Rey at the coast in LA, which is funded by the CIA, so-called black ops, and by the Pentagon to come up with narrative ideas and potential technologies for use by the Defense Department that will also be used in cinema and television. So it's such an intimate connection. It's so deep, it's so profound and so wide. But most of it is not of a kind that you would see in other countries. It's not like the direct subvention that comes with there being a Department of Culture or a Ministry of the Arts that writes a check each year for a film industry or a TV industry. It's much more complicated and multivariate. But it means that at a time of crisis, things can happen. So you've seen just yesterday the World Trade Organization take notices from the United States complaining about restraints of trade by the People's Republic of China. And those restraints of trade are to do with the fact that only roughly 20 to 30 foreign films can come into China each year, and that because of the lax policing of copyright, this means that there's a greater invitation to piracy than would otherwise be the case, but also other restrictive trade practices that it allegedly engages in. And one of the reasons that Hollywood gave so much money to Bill Clinton's election campaign in '92 was that he promised, like many of his promises, he of course broke it, but he promised that he would negotiate hard in terms of the beginnings of what became the World Trade Organization to put Hollywood's desires front and center and foremost, really, amongst the negotiating issues that the United States government would follow. So that's how mutually imbricated they are, but in ways that are much more subtle yet more powerful than is the case with almost any other country you could name, I think. Yeah?
How do remakes fit into your argument?
Well, very well, actually. Both domestic remakes, but better still, remakes from elsewhere. I mean, the number of films now increasingly from Korea and to a certain extent India, but historically very much from France and other countries, of course, where your production costs are minimized because you already have a story. You need, and you even have a film that's been shot that you can follow sequence by sequence. You need to domesticate its story or universalize its story a little bit and the references and so on. But that's a very big issue and has been for a long time. In television, it's even bigger. What are called format sales are absolutely massive. So many of the so-called reality TV shows that we see here were actually created in Croatia or created in Australia or created in Britain. And many of the game shows that people around the world see and the talk shows were actually invented here. So, for instance, some countries have bought the Letterman show. What does that mean? They haven't got Dave, thank God. Appalling person, in my opinion. They haven't got Dave, but they've got Dave's chair, Dave's coffee mug, where it's positioned on the set, the lighting, and all the rest of it. And you see that both with game shows and with dramas, but also with things where you would never expect it, like talk formats. Some of you may have seen this in different places. So it's a very big deal, absolutely. Yeah.
Since you're talking about television, interesting fact about Germany, which I don't know whether it's true for other European countries, is that the same thing was about to happen in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then the trend was reversed, where now television production is largely national, with national themes. Sometimes Hollywood production values, but done by German companies. I don't know to what extent that's true in Italy or France, but it's not, you don't have nearly the domination. The trend is in fact in the other direction.
That's true in many, many countries of the world. The interesting point about that is that television in many nations, once they get mature TV systems and once they go through the initial shock of deregulation, the opening up of the environment to competition from elsewhere, tend to be very national in a lot of what they do. The key issue for most countries around the world is that even as their TV drama increasingly comes from home or from congruent countries rather than from the United States, have a look at what the primetime movies are that they show. And there Hollywood has extended its dominance massively. And it's getting a lot of its revenue in addition from things like format sales. The German case is interesting for another reason, of course. This loophole's now been closed, but as you are probably aware, about 2 years ago, possibly $1 billion of finance to Hollywood came from German tax write-offs. And in the case of Britain, it's been tens of millions. So, you know, I knew a guy who was head of drama at A&E, you know, that cable channel, A&E cable channel. He used to get a phone call, when's the German tax year end? I don't know what time of year you have to put your taxes in Germany. Anybody know? Anyway, whenever it was, a month before that, he'd get a call from the dentists of Frankfurt and Hamburg saying, I need to lose $10 million. How can I do it? And he'd say, oh, easy. Invest in one of our ridiculous films that don't make money. We'll take your dough, it's fine. And around the same time, he would get calls from the Minnesota Film Board, because most states in the US have film commissions that are set up to try to attract production away from Hollywood. And they'd say, hi, we're coming to New York. We've got a couple of tickets for the Knicks game at the Garden. Can we come and talk to you about filming your next project in Minnesota? And he'd say, you can come to New York and enjoy your free tickets, but you can't see me because I'm seeing the dentist from Freiburg who has more money than the whole of Minnesota to spend. So we're not going to Minneapolis. We're going to stay in New York and LA and use the German tax write-offs to spend. In many cases, it was literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Quite astonishing. Accountants, dentists, doctors, lawyers who need to lose money. We're better than Hollywood. Right? So Germany is a key player, in fact, in how Hollywood does its business, which is another sign that it's not about laissez-faire supply and demand mechanics. It's about utilizing the state in every conceivable way, both domestically and internationally, to buttress the absolutely true case that there are narrative skills, storytelling abilities, and technological capacities in this country that are quite extraordinary. Yeah. So, anybody else? When you meet, one of the great things about being in New York or Hollywood is that you do meet people who want to tell you stories like this about the dentist, the burgers of these different countries. And then when you say to them, doesn't that sit oddly with your claim that Hollywood is laissez-faire and everywhere else is indolent and is drawing on the teat of the big mama state? And they say, no, we're very competitive. I mean, the German money could go anywhere. So let me go on now to talk about animation. Anybody here watch much animation or do it? Some of you might make it. No one. Well, you know what animation is, Mickey Mouse, right? And Mickey Mouse is big business. Some of you will have heard of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which derived in part from the Sonny Bono amendments to the Copyright Act after he died. Why did this happen? This happened because right around the time when Trent Lott, now deputy leader of the Republicans in the Senate, then Senate majority leader before his temporary fall from grace for endorsing segregation in the United States, shortly before he made his unfortunate remarks, the Disney company worked out that their trademark on Mickey Mouse was about to end because the Copyright Act as amended in 1976 said that I think you had 70 years when you could continue your copyright. Mickey comes out in the late 20s. Everything was about to go to hell in a handbasket because of this. So they gave Lott's campaign a lot of money, as they did to other Republicans, and of course even more money to Democrats. And so legislation was passed in the House and the Senate that extended the Copyright Act, the Copyright Act's period under which you could claim copyright well into the 21st century. This then led to the infamous incident when Disney informed the police of a childcare centre where children had been drawing on whiteboards pictures of Mickey Mouse, and this was infringing copyright. The childcare centre was raided. Right? This is around the same time as they were trying to imprison 11-year-olds for setting up websites to do with Harry Potter, they being, in this case, Warner Brothers, another one of our charming multinational corporations operating in the interests of children. So there were all kinds of opportunities that were taken, that were seized through the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. A lot of money to be made. Remember that copyright is allegedly there to encourage creativity. I make this, it's mine, it's popular, I make money from it, therefore I'm encouraged to produce more. But you would think that after 80 years of the mouse, the idea that by having control over Mickey, they were going to make better Mickeys would have kind of been blown out of the water, because it's transparent that they don't do that. When was the last good Mickey Mouse film that Disney made? When was the last Mickey Mouse film that Disney made? Other than saying they're all Mickey Mouse, of course. Anyway, so that's the current condition, I suppose I would say, of copyright to do with animation. But I want to talk specifically about this division of cultural labour story to give you an instance. US cartoons, not just Disney, but also Hanna-Barbera and others, were increasingly being drawn in Japan from the early 1960s. And it's been common now for decades to utilize cheap but skilled labor in Asia, nowadays it's Vietnam and to a lesser extent Korea, to draw the cartoons that we see today. Not all of them necessarily, but create often the frames in between particular components. So you get a kind of fetishized production process whereby the high-end stuff is done in Southern California or anywhere in the United States, sometimes in Europe, and the low-end stuff is done elsewhere, and you put the two together as the director. Nowadays, of course, you can have, because of new technology, real-time collaboration across sites, across time zones, through the internet, through dedicated satellite links. So now what we've seen is that in 2001, the global animation and special effects industry was about $25 billion. Last year, it was $70 billion. So that's just in a 5-year span, an extraordinary increase in the value of global animation as a consequence of this new technology and the business of getting so many different people in so many countries to do different bits of a story. And as this labor of cultural production gets departmentalized into units that work on multiple tasks in multiple locations, the technologies of connectivity have become integral not only to these artists being able to share their work and criticize one another, but also to managerial oversight. So you can find that there are, for example, both big firms that control the industry and then small firms that contract in to do little bits of it. You can find them littered up and down the hinterland of California. There are about 3,000 firms employing fewer than 10 people that provide special effects things for the music industry, the TV industry, and the film industry nationally. And they often connect up to other, again, very little firms, littered throughout Western Europe, a little bit Eastern and Central Europe, and especially Southeast Asia. The Asian Media Festival, which is an annual event, brought together 1,500 each year, brings together about 1,500 producers and distributors of animation from Asia, Europe, and the US, and they talk about regional integration, they talk about the global animation trade. And the idea always, of course, is to cut costs wherever possible. And the films, in particular, are given the title of being Hollywood productions, but really Hollywood becomes not so much a physical place as a brand name. Of course, it would be silly to suggest that Hollywood simply enters people's minds and dominates them without there being active audience choice, interpretation, and so on. I'm sure everybody here has films and television programs and all forms of cultural production that they, like Roland Barthes' great J'aime, je n'aime pas. They like and they don't like. They have their little binaries. I like that, I don't like that. You sit around in the coffee shop, you sit around in the dorm, you sit around in the pub, and you say, I didn't like this because. Right? So it's not as though everything works uniquely in one way. So what do these companies do when the films are not successful? Well, sometimes they don't care because they have the burgers to sign the checks and the taxpayers around the world to pay the cost. But they have other means as well, and I want to talk about my family-friendly favorite, Disney. Disney ensures that it profits from its many, many unpopular films through merchandising. 46% of annual revenue to Disney in the film sector comes from sales of things, the stuff that you and your children and other loved ones want to have. And much of the manufacturing of toys, apparel, and all the other whiz-bang objects that we're called upon to purchase, much of that manufacturing is undertaken in third world countries by subcontractors who are exploiting low-paid women workers. Sound like anything we know? Nike, that's the model. Where Nike, which used to be a Pacific Northwest company where design and production went on, now in its declaration to the Internal Revenue Service that will be putting forward in a few days, does not describe itself as a manufacturer, does not describe itself as being in the clothing industry or the footwear industry or the textile industry. It says it's a marketing company. Right? That's what Nike says it is. And it's shown the way. It's not our fault if these subcontractors in Indonesia or Pakistan are exploiting labor. Look, we design the ads. That's what we do. And it's very much that way with Disney. So, for example, take a film from 10 years ago, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Anybody see this, the animated Disney film? A few of you. There were only about 7 people, apart from those in this room, who saw this film. But it did sensationally in toy terms, because the products just for The Hunchback of Notre Dame were made in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Mexico, Brazil, El Salvador, Thailand, Malaysia, St. Lucia, Colombia, the Philippines, Honduras, República Dominicana, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, China, Haiti, this country, Japan, Denmark, and Canada. I can't name many more countries than that. It's like that thing on YouTube where the person asks people in the street, how many states, how many governments can you name that begin with U? And people can't name any. I don't know many countries other than those. And of course, Disney is notorious for its labor abuses in China. There's a group called the Hong Kong Christian Industrial Committee, which investigates the deals that China does with Disney. Disney's paying people between 13 and 36 cents an hour to make its products. And again, this is mostly young women workers who, rather like the people who work for Japanese or Taiwanese companies in the southeast of China, come from very poor villages in the north, arrive at ages anywhere between 11 and 16, are sacked when they get to 20, work 7-day weeks, sometimes 16-hour days for money like this. So if anybody see the 101 Dalmatians? Confession time. Did you enjoy it?
I have 3 kids. So
Right. Did you buy them a T-shirt?
No.
Good. The T-shirt, the people who made the T-shirts for 101 Dalmatians were paid 12 cents an hour. So, and this is very much about getting at children. Animation is a great way of developing the children's market.
Are you saying that there's no connection between a popular film and the merchandising? That even lousy films that don't sell?
Yeah, exactly.
Because the toys are so attractive?
It's partly that the toys can be very attractive. It's also that they amortize their costs by cutting deals with distributors and retailers that bring them in a lot of money in advance. So before they know the film's a dud, they've already sold these things to major department stores. That's basically how it works. And then sometimes objects take off even when films don't. That often happens, yeah. So any other questions or issues about the animation bit? Yeah? All right, so I want to go on now to talk about the future. Because up to now, it seems as though I think I am portraying a picture of Hollywood as an omniscient creature. But there's another argument, which is the one we often see in the bourgeois media, that says Hollywood is in crisis, Hollywood is falling apart. So I want to run that line extensively, but I hope not too boringly, and then come back with an alternative line, because this is a Hegelian dialectic that we all must, of course, embark upon at some point in our lives, and this is mine. For example, isn't Hollywood in crisis because it's held responsible for the poor esteem in which the United States is held around the world? If you look at the public opinion polls over the last 5 years in most parts of the world, this country's gone from being an extremely popular nation state to perhaps the most loathed country in the world. Extremely popular to extremely unpopular. And if you look at the Wall Street Journal or the Los Angeles Times, then you will see opinion pieces at least once a month in the op-ed sections or the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal that blame this on liberalism and specifically Hollywood. That Hollywood is said to is taken to the bar for encouraging loose sexual morals, irreligious attitudes, and destructiveness. And these are said to be associated thereby, in the minds of the world public, with the operations of the film industry and with the American public more generally, as well as the American state. That's the big argument. However, if you look back to September 11th, 2001, within about a day, my spiritual uncle, Jack Valenti, the aforementioned former private secretary to a president of the US and long-time boss of the Motion Picture Association, he said, and I quote, "Going to the movies is the American remedy for anxieties of daily life." So he was saying, in the same way that George W. Bush said, go out and buy things, we can restore our normalcy after this terrible, unjustified attack by going and doing the things we do best, which are pleasure, right? But as I said, if you look at, so that's the official position from the Motion Picture Association, the peak employer body of the producers. But if you go to the bourgeois media, you get a very different story, and not only from the right, but from liberal hegemons as well. I'm thinking of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the kind of the liberal Democrat establishment of foreign policy in the United States, although there is Republican participation in it. The Council on Foreign Relations announced in a formal diatribe that anti-Americanism, and I quote, is fueled by the broad sweep of American culture, Hollywood movies, television, advertising. And you got some similar concerns from within the aesthetic realm itself. Woody Allen said, and I quote, "Too bad the terrorists of the 11th of September learned life in Hollywood movies." The European Audiovisual Laboratory, which is one of the many observatories around the world, sadly we don't have one in the US, set up to monitor how film and television circulate globally. The European Audiovisual Laboratory, part of the European Union, warned that regardless of the cultural messages within Hollywood movies, the things about sex, about money, about pleasure, about violence, regardless of the cultural messages, Hollywood was partly responsible for anti-US sentiment because of its key role in the international economy, an international economy that either excludes or dominates so much of the world, that it stood for the US as an economy and as a military and as a state simply because of its size and its reach, regardless of its textual content. And Newt Gingrich, who was the principal architect of the Republican success electorally in the 1990s and is maybe now standing for president in 2008, who was, of course, a former Speaker of the House and somebody who didn't get tenure as a history professor, but that's no crime. I nearly didn't get tenure at NYU. I mean, $10 at a crucial moment out of the back pocket to hand to the dean and everything was fine. But without that payoff, I may not be standing here before you because I didn't have my green card at that point. So Newt, whom we don't attack for failing to get tenure, Newt argued that US foreign policy had nothing to do with anti-Americanism, completely irrelevant. The only factor that mattered was Hollywood. And he is one of many calling for a new public diplomacy from both right and not maybe left, but certainly liberal left, arguing that there's something profoundly wrong about US popular culture, profoundly negative, that spreads an inimical view of this society internationally. And what Gingrich called for, and I quote, was to put the world in touch with real Americans, not celluloid Americans. So there is, in a sense, this crisis for Hollywood for being blamed for anti-Americanism around the world. And then there's an argument that's about domestic issues, right? From every imaginable political position. For political progressives, for example, Hollywood is said stereotypes women, will only allow women to have sexualized romantic roles, no decent roles for women actors over the age of 30 and a half, very few for people over the age of 40 unless they're alcoholic anti-Semites from Australia or actually upstate New York from a crazy brand of Catholicism. Mr. Gibson, and so on. Jack Nicholson can have 20-year-old women fall in love with him on screen. He's 100 years old, he can barely move. But no woman over the age of 30 and a half can be of any significance. All these sorts of arguments from progressives. Arguments about racism in Hollywood, both in representation and opportunities for those people of colour to participate in filmmaking behind the screen and in the sort of front office jobs and so forth. Arguments that child audiences are exploited, that there are negative impacts on children's images, self-images, negative impacts on their looking after themselves through things like, for example, eating disorders and so forth. All those critiques that we're familiar with that come from left and right, in a sense, about Hollywood's representation of normalcy, of heteronormativity, and all the rest of it. So there is a critique of that. There's a critique of product placement, peddling hidden advertising by taking money in advance from all sorts of companies. I mean, the classic is the tobacco industry as part of the master agreement that was struck between the states and the tobacco giants 10 years ago. Hollywood undertook to cease product placement of tobacco in its films, since which time it's increased by about 100% on an annual basis, believe it or not. So those sorts of product placement issues, and it's not just tobacco, it's alcohol, soft drinks, cars, and so on. Watch a James Bond movie and you're watching more advertising than you see on MTV or on Home Shopping Network. All those things have led to accusations of manipulation, exploitation, and inappropriate messages for young people. In other words, the industry is in trouble politically for its signs and its narratives. And the other area where Hollywood supposedly is in trouble is in fact economically, as it confronts structural adjustments of a kind that are changing all the cultural industries, with the digitization of screen texts, I'm including here cinema, television, and games, and associated shifts in the division of labour. All right, let me go through this anti-Americanism argument. This is a tough one to run. During the 1980s, the height of the Second Cold War and a series of interventions in Latin America, it's true that the United States as a government was deeply unpopular around the world because of its foreign policy. There was a massive change under Bill Clinton in terms of the image of the United States, though not in most of the Middle East. This was due to rhetoric and style as much as substance, if you like, but there was a huge drop in anti-Americanism and a rise in positive feeling towards the United States in the vast majority of the world's population, as measured by every conceivable opinion poll you look at through the 1990s. And of course, it zoomed into popularity after the horrors of 2001. But immediately upon the invasion of Afghanistan and skyrocketing downwards, if you like, in the case of the invasion of Iraq, things have taken a turn for the worse. There is a direct correlation with US foreign policy since 2001 and the low standing of this country internationally. You might not like that fact, but it is a fact. It's incontrovertible, regardless of what the Wall Street Journal and others say. There are so many studies, so many opinion polls, virtually all pointing in the same direction. And ironically, if you want to find the country in the Middle East that is most opposed to Hollywood movies and allows the fewest to be seen, it is, of course, Saudi Arabia, which amongst Arab countries is, of course, our best buddy, our closest ally, along with Egypt, which also doesn't like Hollywood popular culture very much. So and many of the countries that have diplomatic problems with the United States are actually very significant importers of Hollywood products. I'm thinking of Morocco as one example. And in many cases, when young people in particular in the Arab world are interviewed about their views of the United States, the views are almost all negative except for one thing: entertainment, popular culture. Don't like the government, don't like the people, love the fashions, love the music, love the style of life. Very similar to part of what you were saying, I think, with reference to the former Soviet Union. Yeah? And it's a familiar story not only in the Middle East but many parts of the world. The big difference that has happened since 2001 is that whereas in the 80s under Reagan and Bush's father, the calumny, the opprobrium, the loathing of the US around the world attached itself almost exclusively to the government, since 2004 in particular, it's an opprobrium attached to the citizenry as well, for effectively endorsing the invasion of Iraq, the occupation, by voting Bush in again. And so now you see the opinion polls saying it's not just the government, it's the people. What were they doing? Right? This is the argument. Again, you may not like it, but that's the argument. So I think we have to say that the claim that Hollywood leads to anti-Americanism is entirely spurious, entirely without foundation. It may be that arguments against the United States are illustrated with reference to Hollywood, but I don't think we can sustain it, at least in terms of the data that we have available. So let me just finish up by talking about Hollywood's economic crisis. What are the financial problems it faces? Well, a lot of people have just stopped going to the movies. I mentioned that the core theatrical attendance group domestically is people aged 14 to 29. So there are a number of people in this room whose age cohort goes and a number whose age cohort simply does not go. Similarly, people are no longer watching television in ways that have funded Hollywood drama in the past because of the possibility of skipping through advertising, because of the possibility of getting premium channels on cable or satellite that don't have commercials. At the same time, we see the Motion Picture Association and the US government complaining about piracy of Hollywood movies and TV shows. Now, they actually have decided they don't want to use the word piracy anymore because they say that it has Robin Hood connotations, is the official expression. So they haven't worked out what they want to call it. They just know that piracy is Johnny Depp. They just know that piracy sounds fun. It sounds like something you would make money from, so we can't have it. But their argument is whatever that is, the illegal use of products that have not been properly paid for their reuse is costing, and we're given new figures every week about hundreds of billions of dollars in various markets and so on. And lastly, Hollywood's in trouble economically because, as many of you will be aware, it's now so easy to produce and to distribute at relatively low cost, extremely good-looking forms of screen entertainment. Right? It's very easy to shoot something that looks extremely good, that doesn't cost hundreds of millions of dollars, that in fact costs under $10,000. Not in terms of the salaries you pay, but the availability of the equipment and the capacity through the web to distribute it. So, let me run through the strong case for this very quickly. I'm trying to finish in maybe 5 minutes. Does we have 5 minutes more for me to talk? Yeah. So on the audience, multiplexes, the phenomenon of the 80s, the big, almost arena-like and mall-like movie theatre complexes around the country that were invented in Canada but quickly came to the United States, managed to bring people back in to movie-going after they'd abandoned it in the 80s with the rise of the VCR and the fact that so many theatre chains were in disarray financially and therefore it wasn't fun to watch movies at theatres. But can the multiplex phenomenon be repeated? Is there another way in which you can invest? Well, arguably not. And because there is now, as part of digitization, a massive cost increase that exhibitors have to face, what are they going to do to turn thousands of cinemas across the United States into places that can receive films digitally? Not just screen them digitally, but receive them. Because, the idea is you'll no longer literally send a film that goes to a movie theatre in order for it to be screened. They'll all be sent electronically. This is a massive cost. It's the kind of cost that hasn't been faced since the conversion from silent film to sound in the 20s and 30s. So how many of them will be able to do that? How many of them will be able to make the multiplexes still exciting and fun things to be? Now, let's talk about this piracy issue. There are probably plenty of people in this room who have broken copyright by copying films or music illegally and showing it in class or just doing it in the dorms and so on. And you're probably aware that the Motion Picture Association and the Recording Industry Association of America have spies who are probably paid students and staff here at Middlebury, certainly most universities in the United States, to find out which students and faculty are breaking copyright. In addition, there are snoops, spies, watching electronically to see where things are being downloaded. I'll give you an example. At NYU, when a film was downloaded onto a faculty member's computer illegally 3 years ago, within 5 minutes of the download, the dean had been informed by the Motion Picture Association whose computer this had been done on and was asked to take action. So it's a very big issue for these institutions. Nevertheless, people know how to do it. When I came back from China 6 years ago, I flew into an undisclosed location in the United States known as either JFK or LaGuardia, I can't remember which, and the customs guy said, which group are you with? And I said, I'm not with a tour group, I was there for work and so on. They said, no, which rock band are you with? Like that kind of group. And I said, I'm not with any, I'm a professor. And they said, no, we can tell, you're in one of those English rock bands. And they took me backstage, as it were, and they said, we won't check you for drugs or illegal DVDs that you got when you were in China if you'll give us DVDs of your performances. And they showed me the Rolling Stones performances on computer screen that they'd been handed in return for not. And I kept saying, I'm really sorry, but I know I look like I could be a drummer or something, but I'm actually not. Here's my NYU faculty card. There's a little picture, the name, and so on. So after an hour of being forced to watch Keith Richards play the guitar, I was allowed finally to leave. But it's, as you know, if any of you have spent time, not only in this country but in other countries, there are plenty of cultural bazaars, in a sense, in which texts are circulating illegally. I saw DVDs of Pearl Harbor in China the day after I had been to a preview in New York. I had a cab driver in Mexico City last year who'd just seen Casino Royale 3 weeks before it opened. Right? So this is going on, not only in dorms, I'm sure not at Middlebury, of course, but in other centres of higher learning, but it's going on around the world, and it appears to be unstoppable. And then there's this question of the low cost, the ease of entry, that it's now supposedly so easy to manufacture screen texts with, the latest Apple and so forth, but also send them out through the latest Apple because of the internet. So that's the argument. Now, against that, Let me run the counter-arguments and then I shall shut up. On the audience, it's true that US theatrical attendance is down in absolute terms and, as I indicated, as a proportion of receipts worldwide. But that is a long-term, if not entirely consistent trend. Films are now at the semiotic apex of screen production, but they're not at the financial apex. Films are essentially advertisements, they're commercials, not only for products that are placed within them, they're commercials for DVD sales, they're commercials for downloads. So the idea that the box office of a film is its total success, which has never been true financially, is not even close to being true now, because so many screen texts are there not because of their immediate popularity, but their popularity down the line. Give you an example from television. Did any of you ever watch Alias? No? So Alias, the least popular in ratings terms screen drama ever to be renewed for, 3 or 4 years on primetime television. Why? Highest selling DVDs of any television series in history. And they knew that, and they could see that was happening not only through DVD sales, but the amount of activity talking about the DVDs and in expectation of the release of the next season's DVDs in various discussion groups that were available electronically. One of the great things about electronic discussion groups is that they're fantastic for marketing to engage in surveillance of the audience. We know where you live. We know what you like. We know what turns you on. And, better yet, you give us story ideas. You tell us you want this to happen in the next season. There are enough of you saying it's a good idea. Boom, boom, boom. Off it happens. The Star Trek franchise, for example, on this score, not the TV show, but the series of movies, was kept going, taking certain directions, because deals were struck between Paramount, which I think owned the property, and fans, that fans would go minimum 9 times each for full ticket price in return for keeping Spock alive, for example, for a certain number of episodes. So these things go on. And it seems to me that this use of cinema as a marquee billboard is going to sustain the industry. On the cultural piracy front, yes, this activity is endemic around the world. Guess what? It's, in a sense, a free marketing form. It means that people who never were able to afford to watch a Hollywood film, but who are in emerging economies, now know what they look like and like them and are interested. And you didn't pay a cent because they were never going to be wealthy enough to have bought tickets or DVDs or VCRs. And now they know all about you, and you didn't have to hire a marketing manager to make it happen. Now, this is hard to quantify, but it's something that the industry knows but won't be honest about. So that's another side where I think there's a counter-argument, at least, to the claim that this is destroying the finances of the sector. And then the third one, ease of entry. Well, yes, okay, but we talked earlier about the proportion of Hollywood budgets that goes on marketing. It's all very well to make your film cheaply and say, well, there's the web. But how do people find out about it? How many people who are going to pay money to see it will find out about it? And increasingly, how fast will your film be downloadable? You're probably aware of the debates going on in Congress right now about whether or not there should be one speed for all for broadband downloads in the United States. Yeah? And that debate means that, for instance, if you're CBS or you're Warner Brothers, if the debate goes the way that it may go, and network neutrality is destroyed, then you cut a deal with AT&T or Time Warner or whoever it is, and you say, anybody who's downloading our CBS series or our Warner Brothers movie, it will be downloaded at very high quality in 3 minutes. But if you are an independent feminist collective or you're a kid in a backyard, how long is your movie going to take to download? 10 hours? 11 hours? You're in the slow lane and the corporates are in the fast lane. And how good will it look? Not very good, because you can't afford the money to get the fast lane. It's a sort of freeway model, if you like. So that issue, along with the marketing promotion question, is cutting out this ease of entry question. So, okay, there are some problems that Hollywood faces, as long as the Republicans are in power. And this is where I'll finish. Hollywood gives money to Democrats. Because of this, immediately upon George W. Bush's election at the end of 2000, Wall Street turned against Hollywood, right? And what you saw was a drop in the value of the culture industry stocks and an immediate increase in the value of the stocks of tobacco companies, mining companies, other extractive industry companies, and defense contractors, who basically give money to the Republican Party. 80% of campaign contributions from energy, tobacco, and the military contractors went to George Bush, and so you get a victory, if you like, at the finance capital level, a victory for oil, for cigarettes, for guns, over celluloid, CDs, and wine, and wires, because they're Democrat things. The other stuff is Republican stuff. So the market value of tobacco, of the extractive industries, of military contractors rose by 80% in the year that Bush became president, 80% on average. The value of the culture industry contributors to Al Gore's campaign dropped by between 12 and 80%. So at one level, you see bad news for Hollywood in terms of how much Wall Street's going to back it. But if now that they've won the Congress, or sort of won the Congress, in 2006, their capitalization is looking better. If they win the presidency in 2008, you'll see capitalization of military contractors, of tobacco, of mineral extraction going down, and capitalization of the culture industries, wires, wine, CDs, movies, TV going up. Through all that, despite the fact that they get punished for being aligned with liberals, as I indicated earlier, Hollywood has a very long history of mutual imbrication with Washington. The State Department, the Commerce Department, the Pentagon. There's a full-time office of the Pentagon dedicated to nothing but liaison with Hollywood, which means, as I said, vetting scripts, but also providing access to aircraft carriers for cheap and so forth. There are, as I said, the connections made about constructing fantasies about acts of terror that can be thwarted and so forth. And that long history, along with the fact that for all that it may have had these opportunities that are derived from chance, like World War I and World War II, there is, of course, an incredible ingenuity, a cultural brilliance, an organizational capacity that Hollywood has that has allowed it to rebound from all kinds of shifts and shocks, and I think we'll do so again. So let me stop it there. Thanks a lot.
Time for about 15, 20 minutes. Questions?
Maybe you've already asked your questions or made your statements, but you don't. If anybody has statements as well as questions, that's fine too. If you've got points of argument, disputation, or questions about particular industry sectors that interest you, that I might be able to help with, then fire away. Yeah.
Not a question, but
in
this week's New Yorker, there's a wonderful cartoon on your issue of the word piracy.
Is there?
Robin Hood is sitting in his accountant's office, and the accountant is saying to Robin Hood, "You've got to declare and pay taxes on what you steal from the rich, but you can get a deduction on what you give to the poor." I have to go.
That's lovely. Thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting, by the way, on a copyright front, Robin Hood is now a pretty popular TV show in the United States on BBC America. And of course, Robin Hood is good, like Herman Melville's good, because they're out of copyright. So anybody can print Moby Dick if they have the money, and anybody can make a TV show about Robin Hood if they have the money. Very good to reach back into the recesses of aesthetic and military history if you want to do this. You can read Melville online for free. You can't read F. Scott Fitzgerald online for free. You can read anybody who basically wrote their fiction before 1923 online for nothing. But The Great Gatsby was taken down from free online access as a consequence of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Yeah?
I noticed going to movies recently that there's an increasing amount of advertisement before the movie begins.
Right.
Do you have any insight as to why that's a recent development?
Sure. And you've probably noticed that increasingly it's narrativized. So it looks like it's a TV show. Instead of it just being individual commercials, and now we present a story, and the story will be linked by having some quasi-trailers for movies, and then straightforward advertisements for things, and then hope you enjoyed the show, and just to remind you what you just saw. This is half an hour, and then you get the trailers, right? So part of that is to do with the fact that exhibitors are really on the margin. I mean, the real money that's consistently made from movies is made by distributors. Exhibitors are on the margin. They don't actually break even through ticket sales. They make money through advertising and through concessions. So popcorn, sweets, drinks, that's where they make a lot of their money. And they need to be able to fund their exhibitionary costs, not only through that, but through increasingly advertising. However, there has been a bit of a consumer movement in the United States against advertising, and that's why there's been this attempt to make the ads look like they're part of like a TV show where things are being presented to you. This is very much like what Hollywood did when it was first threatened by TV. When television took off in the United States in the post-Second World War period, it took off at the same time as there was a suburbanization of the country. So you got televisualization simultaneously with suburbanization. This decimated the movie-going audience, decimated the inner cities, because returning GIs and their families moved out to the suburbs and didn't bother to come into the inner cities anymore for recreation because they could watch TV, right? So Hollywood had a dilemma. What was it to do? And it had two immediate strategies, one of which worked, one of which didn't. The one that worked was, guess what? They've got all this TV. What are they going to put on it? Oh, I know. We can recycle old movies that actually no one's seeing, except in a few repertory halls in Chicago and New York. We can reuse these films by selling them to the TV networks, and that's why they managed to, in a sense, get more money out of things that they'd written off 20, 30 years earlier. The second thing they tried to do, which didn't work except for Disney, was they bought time on different TV networks to advertise their product, not in commercials, but by pseudo-programming. So a lot of us grew up watching, Walt Disney Presents, or whatever it was called, on a Sunday night, say, that would be, a program where Uncle Walt would show you Mickey's latest adventure and show you how some cute animal in a far-off country ran up and down a tree, and maybe you'd even see part of a feature film being shot. All the studios tried that. Each of them in the mid-50s would have like half an hour a week that would be a program, a lot like faux programming that you're talking about, that we see now in movie theatres. And it remains to be seen whether people will put up with it, because really, you're told the film starts at 7. The film doesn't start till 7:45, right? And you're watching all this stuff. You could easily be sitting on a tarmac in an airport having fun. But that's the reason it's there. Exhibitors are really at the margin, and digitization costs threaten them hugely. The cost of transforming the technology of their spaces.
If I could pick up on that question, one thing I noticed, and this just might be my own provinciality, when I went to Europe and I saw a movie in Europe in the mid-90s, I noticed that phenomenon of just endless commercials before the film. And I didn't notice that in the States, and now it seems to be. Is that something that started first in Europe, do you think, or?
Gee, I don't know that. I mean, I wasn't regularly watching films in the United States until the mid-1990s. And although I know a lot about the history of exhibition, and I know something about the history of exhibition, and I know a fair bit about commercials in the contemporary period in theatres, I don't know in the past. I don't know whether any of you have, from your own historical experience, got a sense of this, actually. In the States, yeah. Or in,
when did that start? I think it is starting. I remember first noticing it in Europe.
What is this?
Yeah,
right.
What is this? And it sort of went against the argument that America is the place for advertising.
Yeah.
And then just now it seems
What was it?
something
Quite
comes
probably
in.
came out of, it was a spin-off of the newsreels that used to go.
Right.
But the only thing that they would advertise was refreshments. It's time to go about. Time. But that was the only place that ran until pretty far along. I mean, and there wasn't much. There certainly wasn't as much as there was in England. I mean, I go into films for years. The first time when I started watching films in the '60s, because there were advertisements then.
Yeah.
They were mostly refreshment type things or chocolates.
But cigarettes, lots of cigarettes,
cigarettes,
chocolates, absolutely, yeah. No, that's absolutely true. So it's interesting, it was a bit more recent here. It's funny, there are all kinds of forms of popular culture commodification where the US lags behind. It's inconceivable in most parts of the world that you would have baseball and football uniforms that simply gave a number, a name, and a team. In Europe, for sure, and many parts of Asia, and the Middle East, they would be sponsored by a company. All the referees and umpires would be sponsored by a company. They would, show all this on their uniforms. So whilst, again, it's about the whole anti-American thing. A lot of things that are associated with the downside of US popular culture may in fact be innovations from elsewhere. They're really critiques of a certain kind of ownership and commodification, but they get slated as critiques of the United States, I think, anyway. Anybody else? Looks like we're done. So thank you, everybody, very much for coming along. Okay, great to meet you. Great to meet you. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, I will. Well, I might find out exactly where it is.